Hey everybody, how's it going? My name's Paul, and you're with Thinking Christian, and what I'm going to be doing is giving a sketch of the argument, what I call the B&A, or the Bayesian necessity argument for the existence of God. Don't get scared by all these words. I'll explain what they mean. All you need to know is just simple Bayes rule, which you learned in kindergarten or whatever. Actually, probably high school. I don't mean to be condescending, but Bayes rule, really interesting, great stuff. I will admit I think this argument is a little goofy. I don't think it's going to convince anyone that God exists, but I'll explain later why I think it's at least a useful argument, or the mechanism for talking about this is useful. So I'll talk about that later, but let's just get into the argument. So basically, we start out by saying we want to compare P of G, which is the probability that God exists, to P of NG, which is a probability that not God doesn't exist, or what I'll just call P of G bar. And based on, just how probability works, P of G bar is just 1 minus P of G. So you have these what I'm going to call, we'll get to this in a minute, but the prior probabilities, like what's the probability that just God exists at all, and what's the probability that God doesn't exist? Who knows? What I'm going to say is a more useful probability to look at is actually the union, so the joint probability. So what we're looking at is a probability that the universe exists as we see it and God exists, and we compare this to the probability that the universe exists and God doesn't exist. U is like the universe, but what I think it's more helpful to say the universe exists the way we see it or perceive it or whatever. So a lot of arguments for or against God actually use these probabilities inherently. So an argument from evil saying that God doesn't exist is going to say that P of U and G, or this second probability here, is really high relative to P of U and G because of the problem of evil. And of course, theists will probably have their reasons for saying why P of U and G are really high. So basically what that would be, an argument from evil would be saying, hey, look, the probability that there's so much suffering in the world and God not existing seems high compared to the probability that the universe is the way we see it and there's so much suffering, and that God exists. So generally these two quantities we're generally trying to compare, not just the priors P of G and P of not G. So we can go ahead and just write out the joint probabilities using Bayes' rule to say probability of the universe existing and God existing is equal to the probability that the universe exists conditioned on God existing times the probability that just God exists, period. And likewise, the probability that the universe exists and God doesn't exist is equal to the probability that the universe exists conditioned on God not existing times the probability that God does not exist. Now, here's the leap. The theist will likely say or argue that P of U given not G is 0. And what that argument is that God is a necessary being for the universe, for logic, for mathematics, for anything to exist at all. So if that statement is true, that there needs to be God or some entity like God that creates or sustains or just kind of upholds the laws of nature and all of these things, then P of U given not G is going to be 0. There's no way you can observe a universe where God doesn't exist or where God doesn't create anything at all. And as a result, what falls out of this is P of U and not G is equal to 0. That's pretty much what the argument is. So we can rearrange this. We can see this a little bit more clearly by just sort of dividing by these conditional probabilities, which you can only do if they're not 0. So it's a little shaky. But if let's say we just rearrange this, the probability of God existing is equal to the probability that God exists and the universe exists sort of the way we experience it, divided by the probability that the universe exists conditioned on God already existing. And likewise, same thing for God not existing. The probability that God doesn't exist is equal to the probability that we observe the universe and God doesn't exist, divided by the probability that the universe exists conditioned on God not existing. If the probability that the universe exists conditioned on God not existing is 0, as the theist will probably likely argue, then the probability of the universe existing and God not existing would have to be 0 for the probability of God not existing to even make any sense. And this is where it's kind of funny. You can make the argument that even if it's very unlikely that God just exists a priori or as a prior probability, if God is a necessary being for anything to exist, or for a natural world to exist, or for the universe to exist, or the multiverse to exist, or whatever, you still have that God's existence is likely conditioned on us existing, or there being observers to think about God and all of these other things. Now, I really want to know what you think of this argument. Is it dumb? Is it stupid? Is it circular? Because we're kind of using the fact that God is necessary in some way to make this argument. I don't know. In that way, I think it may be like the ontological argument, which I'm not that big of a fan of. Like I said, I don't think this is going to convince anyone who's an atheist, like, oh yeah, God must exist. That's a great argument. But it is interesting. And I think rather than it being a correct or incorrect argument, it's interesting to think about what are the necessary conditions for the universe, for logic, for life. These are really interesting questions that get down to just fundamental reality itself. So yeah, that's kind of why I think this argument is useful or interesting to think about. I admit it's at least a little goofy or whatever. Maybe that's because it's straightforward, but I still think it's useful to think about these conditional and joint probabilities. And instead of thinking like, well, what's the probability that God exists? I don't think that's even a question we have any mechanism for knowing or answering. But we can at least get a general fuzzy idea by playing around with these joints and conditional probabilities. Yeah, like I said, if someone decides, oh, you know what, I must be a theist because of Paul's BNA, Bayesian necessity argument, their theism is probably very weak. If that's the thing that causes them to cross the fence. But still, I think it's useful for this reason. It underlies the assumptions that many theists make about the necessity of God's existence. There are a lot of academic philosophers, Alvin Plantinga, other guys who and girls who talk about this, who talk about, okay, well, if the theist is saying that God exists and an entity like God needs to exist for time, to continue upholding logic and these sorts of things, then if somebody's arguing for atheism, they need to give another plausible account for how the universe is the way we see it, assuming that an entity like God is necessary for the continued upholding or the continued existence of these sorts of things, which is an interesting claim, whether you agree with it or not. It's an interesting claim. What does it take for the universe to exist if God doesn't exist? What does it take for anything to exist, or for logic to exist, or these sorts of things, or mathematics? These are interesting questions that really get at the heart of reality itself. Yeah, and I would just say, I think this would probably be where Dr. Craig, William Lane Craig, would come in and just make the argument, well, because stuff doesn't just pop into existence. I would argue the assumption of theism is at least a rational choice here, right? Because we generally don't just see stuff popping into existence at all, uncaused or whatever. You could probably make the argument that the probability that the universe exists conditioned on God not existing is very low, or at least much lower than the probability of anything existing conditioned on God existing. But then you're left with, to compare these joints, you have to now look at these probabilities of God existing just absolutely or God not existing absolutely, which we have no way of knowing. I think that's just pure speculation here. Any of these are pretty speculative, but that's like extra speculative because we don't know. We don't know what could exist, whether God exists or not. Really, really interesting. Anyway, thanks for watching. Yeah, like I said, let me know. Let me know if you think it's stupid, if you think it's a good argument. Have a little debate. I'm having fun here. This is, like I said, I think it's goofy, but it's at least interesting. Anyway, thanks. I'll see you guys in the next video.